Hey guys, in this video I'm going to show you how I made this Match Made in Heaven render. I was actually inspired by this rebus puzzle a friend sent me that was a matchstick with a halo on it. I thought it was really clever, and I thought about how a lot of products have made in China, or made in USA, or made in wherever written on them. I thought a Match Made in Heaven would be a clever product render. Now, I'd like to stress that I've never actually made a product render before. This is really my first attempt at it. The animation certainly isn't the smoothest, but I'm still quite pleased with how it turned out. I'm speeding on past the actual modeling part because a matchbox isn't that complicated a thing to make. I'd much rather focus on the materials here. The base color of the matchbox is a very light desaturated blue, which is always the sort of color I go for when I want something to look a very pure white. This is done with a noise texture, so there's a little bit of variety, but the colors I picked were very close together, so it doesn't look super obvious. I also added bright colors to the top and one side of the matchbox so I can find it easily on the texture itself when I bake it. I add color to the other side too in a little bit. I unwrapped the box and got to work tidying up the UVs. There are add-ons that make UV tidying quite a bit easier, but I honestly find that if it's not a really complicated object, doing it manually can be sort of relaxing. Now I bake the textures and get to work on editing them. Blender does have a native texture painting tool, and I do use it often, but I generally do prefer the workflow of baking a base color, saving it as a PNG, editing it in Photoshop, and importing it back in. I've been working in Photoshop for quite a lot longer, so I personally feel I have more control in that program. So I baked two versions, one that's just the base color and one that has my brightly colored faces for visibility. I painted on the textures in yellow because I want these parts to be gold, but I do end up changing my mind about the exact shade later on. This is fine though, because in addition to the colored texture, I'm also going to export a metallic map that effectively doubles as a mask I can use to change anything about the designs on the box. For the striking surface, I just found a random hexagon pattern online, used the magic wand to select the inside, contracted the selection a little, and used a rough brush to fill in the pattern. I put a bluish drop shadow on the text, which turns out to be a double-edged sword when I forget to turn it off, making the metallic mask, but it accidentally gives me some interesting imperfections. I also used a scratchy blending brush to make it look like the striking surface had been used a few times. Then I plopped it onto the matchbox, adjusted the UVs a little to account for the aspect ratio, and started fine-tuning the materials. I added a gold foil normal map from Ambient CG, and used my metallic map to mask out the cardboard bits. Then I thought, wouldn't it be neat if the matchsticks themselves had little bits of gold foil on them too? So with a noise texture for masking, I added that too. I fiddle around with the bump as well to make it look like the foil is slightly raised, but honestly, this was completely unnecessary. I never zoom in on the matches in the final render, so anyone who doesn't watch this time-lapse will never know I went to the trouble. Then, with a gradient texture, I softened the transition area between the matchstick and the match head. And to make sure the foil pattern isn't completely identical on every single match, I used the random output of an object info node for the W value of the texture. I duplicated the matches a bunch, using Alt-D instead of Shift-D. Alt-D keeps all of the object data properties linked, which means faster render times. And at this point I decide I don't like the shade of yellow I picked for the gold after all, so I use the mask texture once more to change that. Then I get on with setting up the scene. Nothing about this was overly complicated. I started out with a warm shade of gray for the table surface because I thought a warm tone would contrast nicely with the cool tones in the white of the box, but it just wasn't standing out enough, so I made it dark. The animation itself was pretty simple too. The only trick I can think of here was that I used bounce interpolation to give it that little wiggle when the box shakes open. The lighting also wasn't very complicated either, just a point light illuminating the scene overall, and a spotlight aimed at the side of the matchbox to make it stand out even further. At this point, I thought I was ready to render when I realized there was an ugly-looking hard edge to the drop shadow I'd put on the text. It took longer than it probably should have to smooth this out, because it took me a little while to realize it was on the colored texture as well as the mask, and when I started fiddling with the mask, it affected far more than just the drop shadow, but I got there in the end. After that, I wanted to add that glint that moves across the text, so I added another spotlight and animated it to do exactly that. But it was illuminating the whole box, obviously, not just the text. My solution to this was probably not the most elegant one. I duplicated the box and deleted the other faces besides the label, and I scooched it forward a bit so it acted like an overlay. Then I used the mask for the alpha channel to make the foil be the only opaque part and the cardboard be completely transparent. I put the new label into its own collection and used light linking to make the new spotlight only affect the label. Genuinely, I love light linking so much. It's such an underutilized tool. It was at this point, of course, that I said to myself, I've already sunk 2 hours into this less than 10-second clip, why not throw in a physics simulation just to make my life harder? This took a frankly embarrassing amount of troubleshooting. I don't do physics simulations very often. But in the end, I managed to get the matchbox to fall onto the table, and that was that. I realize this was more of a demonstration than a tutorial. If there's anything I did here that you'd like me to go more in depth on, let me know down in the comments. I'm currently planning on doing more videos about hand painting textures, but I love a challenge and I'll give anything a try. Thank you everybody so much for watching. If you enjoyed, let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you guys later. Bye!